My name is Natalie Heckendorn. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at CSG, and I specifically support our payments organization, CSG Forte. So what we do is payment processing for businesses of all size, small to large. And that could be in-person payments where you're, swiping cards at a retail location. It could be accepting payments online, all the way up to payments in a call center. And we do it in a lot of different ways on a lot of different channels. And it's all in the B2B space, which I love. Before joining CSG Forte, I have been a B2B marketer in financial services, so in the payment space as well, and then in the healthcare industry too. So I've always been kind of a B2B marketer at heart. I love working with businesses, and I love when I get the chance to work with small businesses as well, and just kind of help promote their services through our marketing.
So that payment space has changed a lot in the last few years, I imagine. I remember years ago trying to get some kind of merchant services set up for a business, and it was like completely night and day.
Yes, it is. It's interesting. It evolves so much. And, in the B2C space, you have like the Venmo now, the real-time payments, and business is just kind of starting to dip their toes into it. I think kind of what happens with consumers then kind of slowly trickles down to business. So it's always evolving, and obviously business owners and business people are consumers too, and they want to make payments the same way they do person to person for their business. So it's always changing, always evolving, but it's exciting. Payments maybe don't sound exciting, but it is.
Well, it is exciting for people listening who are waiting for their accounts receivables that are still
Right.
sitting in somebody's, email queue somewhere.
Or
So I
even worse,
imagine.
a check in the mailbox.
Oh, yes. No, well, that's convenient too sometimes, right? It's not us, it's the post office that's late, right? So
Right.
these are things actually, like, again, just to create a little more context for people listening, these are things to help kind of facilitate and take away that friction, right? So that businesses can get paid quicker, I imagine, from other businesses, not just consumers.
Absolutely. I mean, I kind of make a joke about checks. I feel like they're kind of easy to poke at when it comes to payments, right? They're risky. You're putting them in the mailbox with your account number right there. But there's so many digital ways to do things now, and the better the experience is for the person making that payment, the sooner your business is going to get paid. So,
Absolutely, which is a good thing for sure.
right. We all
Um,
want that.
Yes, absolutely. Cash flow is king. So you and I had a chance before we got together today to kind of spitball a few ideas about what to talk about, right? Because, positioning and messaging, there's so many different angles to approach this from. And one thing you suggested that I really liked was the idea of, making decisions about messaging in your marketing based on data and based on knowledge and not just based on opinions, right?
Hmm.
So usually what I start these conversations out with is a very open-ended, like throwing you right in the deep end of the pool with like, tell me a story about a time, that you had to overcome a messaging challenge or a positioning challenge. I don't know if your perspective on using data and knowledge kind of dovetails with a story that you could tell that kind of gives it a little bit more of a context for people listening and how it applies to like the real world.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I am currently at a large organization and have been at larger organizations before that where, marketing decisions can be made by a committee, right? You have a lot of key stakeholders that need to approve. And I think because marketing is fun, right? That's why we love it. We get to have fun, like we get to be creative. You're coming up with branding and product names and advertising, and a lot of your personal opinion goes into that, right? Like I like this word or I like this color. I just don't like that image, and as a marketer, right, that slows us down a lot of times, right? Going back and forth on opinion. And of course, you need to take into consideration what's appealing and what you know about your audience. But I've kind of found that what you know about your audience may actually not be what you think when you dig into the data. I think kind of you said a story, an example that comes to my mind is a few years ago when I was at a financial institution, we had an international banking service. And internally, we always just refer to it as global banking. We use the word global. That's just what it was internally. So that's what it was on our website, on our collateral, how we talked about it. But then we were redoing our website and decided, well, let's just check. that word global. Is that what people use when they're looking for this? And we found out, no, they're using the word international, which, that's a really small change, but it can make the biggest difference when you're trying to attract people to your website, when they're searching for similar products. It's just those little nuances that you might think, well, that's how we call it. I like how that sounds, but that might not be what people think. Um, Another good example is, a similar time where I was working on a product launch and it had the word virtual in the name. And virtual can apply to so many things. And it was talking about virtual payments, but I mean, you type in virtual, you get virtual reality, virtual everything under the sun. And so we kind of realized we needed to be more specific. We couldn't just use the word virtual because someone looking for like a VR video game is not looking for, a virtual payment platform, so SEO, search engine optimization data, is one of my kind of more favorite things to plug into and kind of get that information from, but you can obviously use data from a lot of different sources.
Yeah, and I wanted to dig into that a little further because first of all, I was kind of when you were mentioning the like, oh, I like that word, I like that color, I like that image, from working on lots of different copywriting projects over the years where you'll have that committee, and you'll have agreement on, okay, here's our messaging, right? Here's what we're going to build it on. We're going to start creating content, start creating campaigns based on this. And then inevitably somebody will be reviewing a Google Doc with like the newest email campaign. And they'll be like, well, I don't know about that word. So it becomes like the telephone game, right? Where it's like, by the time you've got to the 7th iteration of that narrative, people are just, it's like a free for all, right?
Yes.
And that can happen. So what you're talking about with SEO, can you describe a little bit more detail about what that process might look like? So not all companies have the same,
Mm-hmm.
kind of tools and resources to be able to dive into that, right? So if you were starting from the beginning and you're kind of looking at your website, which is a good starting point, and you're looking, it's like, okay, we're using certain words here like global, right? Or virtual. And we want to kind of see, is this how our customers look at this? What would be a good starting point for that process?
Yeah, I think especially if you're on the smaller side and you don't have, the luxury of hiring an SEO expert or someone, to kind of manage that for you, there are a lot of tools out there that are, really affordable that make it really easy. You can just, simply type in a word and it will give you suggestions as far as, how many people search for that word, what words might have higher search volume. And some of them will let you dig into your competitors as well, which can be really interesting, to see the words that they're using for similar products. It obviously takes a little bit more time to do it yourself, right? You're having to spend the time to do that research, to use a tool. There's a few resources out there that are free just to look at general keyword search volume. Obviously, purchasing like a software or a platform will give you a little bit more insight and a little bit more help. But there's a lot of resources out there where if you are willing to take the time, can really help you just make some small changes. And I think it's important to have perspective too, right? Like we need to get things done. We need to execute tactics. Like we can't do a research report on every little thing, right? That's not realistic. But I think for the big things, right? Or the big decisions, or to just kind of guide you down the right path, you don't need to look up every little word in your article, but maybe you should take a look at the headline, or, like I said, the name of your product, or, the main kind of what we call like title tags on your website.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, when I'm thinking about the word choice too, I've been speaking lately to a few people that are in the category design space, right? Where they're thinking about how are we introducing something that our audience isn't even really familiar with yet, right?
Mhm.
And, thinking about, are there instances that it makes sense to pick a word, even if it's not the one that is most used? So I'm going to use the global versus international just as an example, right? let's say there was a percentage of the a portion of the market that does use global for whatever reason, and that's really where you're going to focus in as your ideal customer type, for whatever reason. So, are there times where you have to really kind of approach it from that angle, where the SEO tools are not going to know that, right? The SOT, they're
Right.
just going to show you what's more popular. So I know that's kind of like a vague
Mhm.
generalization there, but I thought if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to combine that with what you know about your audience, what you really know about your customers truly. If, obviously you're getting that from the data, but you know that you have customers that are looking for a very specific thing, you have to combine those things together when making your decision. I think it's not one or the other. It's taking all of the knowledge that you have from all the sources available to you. Um, and I think too, sometimes you can figure out, well, maybe it's both. Maybe we lead with a certain keyword or we call our product one thing, but when we're describing it, we use all these other words so that we can pull in everybody or pull in the larger audience, but this very specific group.
No, that's a good idea too. And in addition to SEO tools, um, do you pull from like sales conversations or like actual interactions with customers, and how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think obviously capturing, what we call the voice of the customer is so important for any business, right? Customers number one. So I think, yeah, having that feedback loop with your sales team is so important. What problems are customers talking about? What what things are coming up? What's challenging in your sales conversations? And then outside of just sales, looking at, do you have a feedback loop with your customers? Do you send out, a survey to them ever, maybe after they make a purchase, or do they leave you reviews? Or maybe it's more in depth, depending on what you're selling. Do you send out like a quarterly, more in depth survey on the solution? Or do you do like NPS scores? Or sometimes, do you ever just hear feedback that you want to incorporate? Um, I think that is one of the most ways, the best ways to get information to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with people listening that have smaller company where they're pretty much the wearing all the hats and they're
Yes.
doing the selling, right? And um, I know I can relate to this where you're talking to a customer or a client and you're explaining something and they're kind of like, huh? Yeah, and you're using your words and then
Right.
they're kind of like, and then they kind of say it back to you and you go, okay, like they don't use those words. They don't use that terminology, right? When you are in a situation where there's you've collected some data either directly from the customers or through SEO searches or some kind of analysis, and you're still dealing with a committee, right? So
Yeah.
regardless of the size of the business, unless you're just a solo practitioner, you're going to have somebody else who's a stakeholder, right? And on a practical level, I find that one of the hardest things about executing good marketing is getting alignment. And
Yes.
that can happen with two people, right? Are there any suggestions or tips you can give to, okay, you have a reason to go in one direction, whether it's data or otherwise, and there's other people involved that have maybe different opinions. How do you approach that?
Yeah. Boy, that's the question, right?
That's
Um,
the we're going for the brass ring right now.
right. I mean, I would say what I love about pulling in data like that is I feel like you can't argue with it. If you have to me, it's a fact, right? You're looking at something where this is the truth. Obviously, you could ignore it. You don't have to take that. But I have found most leaders, obviously, if you have quality data and your decision is coming from a sound place and it makes sense to them, even though they might not like it, it's kind of hard for them to argue with, especially when it comes to optimizing your spend, your marketing dollars, right? Like that's number one to all those stakeholders, right? Is the bottom line. And if you can say to them, I know we really like this, or I know we want to say this, but it will probably save us money, or we'll probably have better results if we do this instead. It's really hard to ignore that. And I think if you are ignored, right, after the fact, if you find out that wasn't the way to go, you'll have the data to back that up for next time and say, we did try that before and it didn't work, and here's why we should try this instead.
And we don't quite say "I told you so," but our face
No.
says "I don't know." So let's say you're in a situation where you have, there might be 2 or 3 different ways to approach it, which I think can happen often, right? So you could do some research, or you talk to different customers, or you get some feedback, and not all your customers are going to all say the same thing, right? Some are going to have, different perspectives and different approaches for how they frame the problem, how they frame the solution, the words they use. When you have multiple directions you could go in, what are some ways that you approach testing those? Do you just do it one at a time and see what works, or you try to do like more classic A/B at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I love a good old A/B test, right? If you're able to do it. I think too, depending on the resources you have, I know there are some marketing platforms where you can do a lot more than an A/B test, where you can test a lot of different things at once, but not everybody has the ability to do that. Um, I think testing things like that just to see makes so much sense. I think even on little things like email subject lines, placement on your website, different messaging, and just letting it run for a little while. Make sure you let it run long enough to get, some good baseline data to kind of make your decision. But that would always probably be my answer, is when it's like, well, do we do this or this? And it's like, well, let's just try them both and let's see.
That's it, right? Because if you have that capability, then you don't have to struggle with which is the right one, because you won't know up front. You have,
Right, you don't.
like everybody else that we're making fun of, we have our own opinions too, and they're just
Right.
opinions, right? But those kinds of testing methods, depend ultimately on a certain number of hits, or a certain amount of traffic in order to be valid, right? So, a lot of testing that I see, it's like very small sample sizes, right?
Mhm.
So they'll do like based on very small amount of traffic or very small lists, and then make big decisions based on sample sizes that it could really statistically go either way, right? A lot of people listening, they're not, maybe even with larger companies, they don't really have huge lists yet, or they don't have a ton of traffic, especially in the B2B space, right? It's not like a B2C where you're just like a consumer brand
Mhm.
that has a ton of traffic. Um, what's your gut tell you about, like, you're still, you have a couple of different ideas and ways to approach it, but you're not maybe in a position to test it perfectly. You don't have the tools, or you don't have the traffic. Any suggestions on kind of like how to parse that out?
Yeah, and I think in the B2B space too, and just depending on your industry, like that's a real challenge if you're going after a very small, specific audience, right? If your customer is a very specific type of business, you're probably not going to have a huge number of people searching the web for that, or a huge number of people to test with. And I think it's just knowing your customer, right? Like, if there's a large market for what you're selling or not. And I think just using your own, if you have a good customer or prospect data list, I think using that can be really important. Like I said, is there any kind of customer or prospect like surveying you could do, or A/B testing with your specific audience? Because sometimes you're right. I think they'll surveys will come back and be like, oh, this isn't enough people to get a good gauge on, but maybe for what you're doing it is enough, or it's enough to just help guide you or give you a direction, even if it's not a for sure answer. And I think in marketing and in most other things, like, you have to be willing to test and learn. You have to be willing to fail, and hopefully you can just find a way to fail that's not going to be a huge investment.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, is minimal of losses, right? It's just
Right.
being able to make enough bets so you can find out what's working. And taking the ego out of the equation to be able to say, like, I don't know yet. That's the hardest part, right? Especially with a group.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, as we start to kind of wrap up, I do want to ask you how this relates to how you look at your definition of an ideal customer, right? Because I come from the point of view where, as a copywriter and a coach, where, you know there's a million ways to do it. A lot of companies, big and small, are trying to go after way too many different types of customers, and it really waters down their messaging. Their positioning is very broad, you know
Mhm.
and And when we talk about specific wording, when we talk about those types of choices that you would be able to make better choices from the data, right? I kind of look at it in my head as, well, it's framed around what? What is the, it's framed around, for me, who is your ideal customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are those specific words for, right? And how do we decide between this way to approach the messaging and that way? So for me, ideal customer is kind of like the decision, it's kind of like the final vote there, right? How do you, first of all, even define ideal customer? Because different people look at it different ways. And how do you think about that as a marketer? And when you make decisions about like who you recognize as being the ideal customers for CSG?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we look at our ideal customer personas and everything that we do, especially when it comes to messaging. I think it's a really good exercise for businesses of all size to really put some thought behind who your ideal customers are. I think there's a lot of fun like templates you can use where it's like, oh, what's their name? What's their personal life like? And I think it's not a waste of time, but I think really looking at what really matters to those ideal customers, right? Like, what are their pain points? How does your solution solve their problem? What's their day to day like? What do they really need in a vendor or a partner? And really kind of writing that down, mapping that out, and looking at that whenever you're working on your marketing. I think it's CSG for a lot of our different products. We have different ideal customer personas in different divisions of the company or based on the solution set, and it can vary across a lot of industries. So sometimes you might have a lot of different ideal customers for a specific initiative or a product. And I think what helps me is, okay, like high level, what is our message no matter who you are? No matter what your industry is, what does this solution do? How do we talk about it? How does it differentiate itself? And then, it's more work, but then tailoring the messaging for each ideal customer persona. So, it could be, well, when we're talking to someone in the government space, we really need to talk about these key things because they have some different pain points that we need to cover versus someone in healthcare, for example, versus maybe a small business owner. So, I think you kind of have to tailor your message, which means you might have 3 or 4 messages, right? Like you might have to create a lot of extra content to really hit those ideal customer personas. But I think that's what will make you the most successful is just getting straight to what they care about, right? And what problems they need to solve.